Hello guys, I hope you're doing well. Welcome back to this amazing YouTube channel. My name is Lona. As I usually say, this is a YouTube channel where we share a lot of IT information which is useful for us to grow our IT career. So if you're new here, karibu sana, and remember to check on my previous videos. So today it's a continuation of the previous video which we talked about some resources in Kubernetes. So in the previous video we talked about a pod, we talked about a stateful set, a daemon set, and what else? A pod, a deployment, a pod, a deployment, a stateful set, and a daemon set. So those are some of the resources in Kubernetes. And today we are looking at another resource called a service. So when you talk of a service, it actually comes really handy to expose the applications running inside the pods in a Kubernetes cluster. So if you haven't watched that previous video, kindly watch it first before coming to watch this video because it will help you understand where we are coming from. So once you create a pod, once you create a deployment, you really need to have it exposed so that it can be reached within the cluster and also outside the cluster. And this is where a resource called a service comes in. So what happens is when you create a pod or a deployment in Kubernetes, every pod created is given a specific IP address. Kubernetes gives it a specific IP address. And, the applications can actually reach that pod or that application running within that pod using that IP address. But now the problem is these pods can actually be created and destroyed anytime because when you have a deployment actually gives like a desired state of your Kubernetes cluster. So at any given time there has to be like what you require, and so if you reduce the number of pods or if a node has an issue and it has to like kill a pod or something like that, the pods will actually be killed and recreated. And so every time they're recreated, they acquire a new IP address. So that's definitely a challenge if there was an application trying to reach that pod because now it has a new IP address. So the application can't reach it anymore. And there's no way that that application trying to reach it can keep like a record of the new IP addresses which keep coming up. Another issue is when you have, also remember pods can also be moved from one node to another in the cluster. If you have a number of nodes in the cluster, then there is a possibility that a pod can actually be moved from one node to another. And in that case, they can also acquire new IP addresses, and that connection will actually be dropped. Also, when you have like more replicas of a pod, if you have more than one pod of that application, then that means you must have some sort of load balancing. Otherwise, if you rely on one single IP address, then it means you're only accessing one pod, and there's no load balancing at that point, and there is no assurance of high availability. So we need something that can give us an assurance of, you can reach this pods despite of the changing IP addresses, and at the same time you can have some sort of load balancing, and that's where a service comes in. So it keeps a logical set of pod replicas and a policy by which to access them. So that actually gives us like that guarantee of being able to access the pods regardless of how they are destroyed and created, and also gives us that assurance of load balancing as well. So a service definitely has to reach the target pods using a selector. And remember in my previous video, when I talked about deployments, I showed you a label and a selector. I can still show you right now. So if you look at this deployment over here, you have to give a label to the replicas that you'll be creating and then a selector by which to reach them. Yeah, so a service has to use that selector to reach the target replicas of that pod. Yeah, so there are different types of services. There's those services which expose those applications within the cluster and they're not accessible outside the cluster. And then we have services that has to expose the applications outside the cluster. So one of the most basic service in Kubernetes, which actually exposes services only within the cluster, is called a cluster IP. So it's the default service. If you don't create any service, that's a default service that will be created. And the applications will only, or rather those pods will only be accessible within the cluster. So for the pods running within the cluster, they can actually reach each other through a service called a cluster IP. And this is how the manifest looks like. And I said it's a default one. So if you don't provide, it will still be created as a default service. So it has this kind of configuration. So kind is a service, and then type is a cluster IP, and then you can provide the cluster IP if you want to use a specific cluster IP. But if you don't provide, it can still give a random IP address, because remember it's the default service in Kubernetes. And as I said, it's only accessible within the cluster. Only the applications running within the cluster can reach one another using this cluster IP service. so it's not accessible from outside the cluster. The next service that you can look at is a node port. So a node port is one of those that exposes the service outside the cluster. And what happens is when you create a service of a node port, it makes sure that, or it causes a certain type of port to be opened on each and every node in the cluster. So these are what you call the node port. So a certain port will be opened on each and every node in the cluster. So the service, you will send the request to that service called node port. So it will run on the IP address of the node on that port which is opened, and it still routes the request to the cluster IP. So when you have the service of a node port, you still have cluster IP service created within the cluster, so that the services coming to the node port service will still be routed to the cluster IP, so that you finally reach that application running within the cluster. So this is how the YAML file of a node port service looks like. So the kind is still a service. This is something you must remember. And then the type is a node port, and then you see there's a selector. So a selector has to be there, and then these other ports over here. So you see we've provided here a node port, a node port, which you don't really have to give if you want, maybe if you want a specific port you can provide, but if you don't, it will give a random port to that node in the cluster. Yeah, so the ones you can actually access the applications outside the cluster. So it's called a node port service, and as I said, what it does is it opens a specific port on each and every node in the cluster. So you use the IP address of the node and that port to access that application. So the request will be routed to that IP address and the port on the node, and then still routed to the cluster IP within the cluster. So another service is the service of load balancer. So this one exposes the service externally through a cloud service provider load balancer. So when you're dealing with a cloud service provider, then you'll be able to expose your applications using a cloud service load balancer. So this one will still forward the request to the node port and definitely be forwarded to the cluster IP. So every time you create a service, the other service still exists. So for a load balancer, you'll still have a node port service and you'll still have a cluster IP service. So the request coming to that load balancer will still be sent to the node port, and then also routed to the cluster IP for the service to finally be accessible. So let me show you how this manifest look like for a load balancer. So the service is still a service, and then you give the type as a load balancer, and then you can provide a cluster IP, which is you don't really have to, because by default it will create a cluster IP service, and then the selector definitely, and therefore the ports down here where the application is running. So this is how it looks like for a load balancer. So the most important thing is to give the kind as a service, and then the type as a load balancer, and the selector, so that it knows which ports are we targeting. Yeah, so that's it about the load balancer service. So the last service is called an external name. So this external name doesn't use selectors unlike the previous services. It actually uses a DNS. So it maps a service to a DNS name instead of a selector. So as you can see here, if you want to reach this, for example, like a database running outside the cluster, so you can actually map its domain name to the service, and so this is how this application will be reached. So it's also useful when you want a pod in one namespace to reach another service in another namespace. This one also comes handy. But the most used type of services is actually the cluster IP, which is a default kind of a service in Kubernetes, and it only exposes applications running within the cluster. It's not accessible outside the cluster. And then the node port, which I said, it ensures that a certain port is opened on each and every node in the cluster, so that how you reach the application is through the IP address of the node with that port, and then it forwards the request to the cluster IP, and then finally you're able to access the service. And then the other one is the load balancer, which uses the cloud provider's load balancer and still forwards the request. So when you send a request to the load balancer IP address, it still sends, or the DNS of the load balancer or the IP address, it still sends the request to the node port service, and then still forward to the cluster IP to finally reach the application running within the Kubernetes cluster. And finally, the external name, which I've said, it doesn't use the selectors unlike the others, but it maps a service to a DNS name, yeah, instead of a selector. And it can be used to create services in Kubernetes that represent external components such as databases, as I've said. So you can use actually a domain name of a database to map to that service for you to reach that DB. So that's it about the services in Kubernetes. So if you have a question, kindly let me know in the comment section. If you also have anything that you feel like you want me to talk about, kindly let me know in the comment section. And kindly guys, kindly subscribe to this YouTube channel and share as much as possible. Also ensure to give a like to each and every video and leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Let me know if there's anything you want me to talk about. Leave it in the comment section. But my request is kindly subscribe and share as wide as you can. So let's meet in the next one. Continue enjoying your new year. Bye.